right, so when we're talking about classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning and we begin to compare and contrast them, we find classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning both involve stimuli and responses. That is a similarity. But instrumental conditioning is different from classical conditioning in two important ways, and you're going to need to know these for test purposes. First, the response is voluntary rather than involuntary. In classical conditioning, remember, the response is involuntary. When a particular stimulus is present, the response usually follows automatically. There's little choice on the learner's part. It just happens. In instrumental conditioning, though, the response is typically voluntary. The learner can control whether or not to make that decision. So that is one difference there. Remember that the voluntary nature of responses in the instrumental conditioning is an important one for teachers to keep in mind. In order for such conditioning to occur, learners must first make a response. Many educational applications of behaviorist principles, then, that involves getting students physically and actively engaged in working with academic subject matter. All right, the second one, learning occurs as a result of a stimulus that comes after rather than before the response. Now, what I'm saying there is classical conditioning results from the pairing of two stimulus, one that initially elicits a response and another that begins to elicit the same or similar response. Thus, these two stimuli lead to a certain response. In instrumental conditioning, though, when we look at it, the learner makes the first move in an environmental stimulus, either that be a reinforcer or a punishment, whichever, that typically follows after the learner makes that first move. So the consequences almost always follows the response and seldom occurs when the response hasn't been made. So let's say a teacher who praises students only when they behave appropriately, she's making reinforcement contingent on desired behavior because that's what she wants to happen. In contrast, a teacher who laughs at the antics of a chronically misbehaving student is providing reinforcement even when an acceptable response hasn't occurred. Consequently, the student's behavior is unlikely to improve. So effective instrumental conditioning usually involves integrity as well as contingency. The consequences occur almost immediately after the response. That's the thing I want you to keep in mind. That immediate action, that immediate reinforcement or punishment after response is especially important when you're working with young kids because they expect that immediate gratification. So those are the two differences, and you're going to need to know those for test purposes. Know which one's voluntary, which one's involuntary, and then which one the learner makes the first move on and then decides what to do from there. Okay.